Hello, my name is Alexandra Emanuele. I'm the content editor with GFSR. I'm speaking with Keya Mukherjee, who is a biochemist by training and is a food safety specialist with the FAO's Food System and Safety Division. We're going to be speaking about a sometimes controversial and often in the news subject, which is climate change. And speaking about it in relation to something that you don't often hear it associated with, which is food safety. So thank you so much for speaking with me today, Keya, on this subject.
Absolutely, Alexandra. Thank you for having me.
Can you briefly explain the crisis impacting how it is impacting food safety?
Yes, thank you so much for this opportunity. So it's very important to understand that food really links environment to human health. And we just open the news today and we can see how extreme weather events are really causing chaos all over the world. I mean, they are becoming more frequent, more severe, more unpredictable. Such incidents, they destroy fields, they disrupt food supply chains, they cause food shortages, and it also causes an increase in the occurrence of foodborne hazards. So increased globalization of our food supply chains today, they can really amplify foodborne hazards along the way. And if you can imagine, unsafe food that's produced in one part of the world today can quickly reach another side of the world and can cause a foodborne outbreak. So, and this is a real big problem, especially for populations that live in countries that tend to import a lot of their food. And another very important point that I must point out that foodborne illnesses are usually underreported, which means that it's very difficult to estimate the true foodborne disease burden and conduct timely detection of outbreaks. Now, climate change has a very multifaceted impact on the occurrence and the severity of foodborne hazards. A very small example would be like a single environmental factor like rising temperatures can trigger varying degrees of impacts on different foodborne contaminants simultaneously across the world, which means, for example, it can strengthen the chances of survival of foodborne pathogens like salmonella or vibrio, and can also then alter the occurrence of patterns of chemical contaminants like arsenic or aflatoxins.
A number of foodborne pathogens all at once. Um, what are some steps that manufacturers can take with this knowledge in mind to ensure that food safety can be, because obviously, what would you recommend for these manufacturers?
Right. So what I must point out is that global food chains have been around for centuries, right? We've had it for tea, we've had it for spices, cocoa, and what makes today's food safety landscape so very complex is that it involves moving such a large quantity of commodities across regions that are geographically so distant in such a short period of time. And so food distribution networks have always been quite vulnerable to weather. And weather, if you can want to argue, weather has always been unpredictable to an extent. But what makes climate change so important a factor to consider is because climate change is making it even more difficult to predict these weather events. And this really impedes preparation in advance. And so it compounds the challenges with providing timely response to any foodborne disease outbreaks, apart from also causing obviously economic losses. So it's very vital to ensure that all the moving pieces of a supply chain are well prepared for any potential disruptions. So, for example, setting up widespread early warning systems, which are really part of the core risk reduction approach. This is especially for climate vulnerable countries, but now today all countries are really climate vulnerable countries. Then you have robust monitoring and surveillance systems to actually be put in place to prevent and then control foodborne outbreaks that can also allow to prioritize resources that are needed for certain challenges. And all of these systems will not work if proper information dissemination systems are not put in place, or there is no transparency in data sharing between relevant partners. It's also important to now not have a reactive approach to food safety. We must think of a proactive approach to food safety, do some forward thinking in terms of what can be potential disruptions coming up our way. And it's also important to now improve the traceability across supply chains. For example, with digital innovations, which will play a really important role in making sure the food is safe by tracking and then removing any contaminated food products before it really becomes a food safety issue.
Do you see any country that is really leading, or countries really leading the way in terms of those proactive approaches?
Well, it's very hard to say if there's a country that's doing everything,
Mm-hmm.
but I know that all countries today are definitely, they've woken up to the
Mm-hmm.
idea of the steps that they must take in order to control food safety issues. And as I said also in my publication, that we tend to talk about climate change in terms of how it affects food security, right?
Mm-hmm.
But food security really is about having at all times access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food. So food safety is really an integral part of food security. And if you think about it, I think we recently put out a statistic where we said about 14% of our food that is produced is lost even before it goes to the retail level or the consumer level. And a large chunk of that 14% can be attributed to food contamination issues. And so now that everybody is aware that the global population is rising and everybody is aware that we have to, ramp up our food production and food security, people around the world, policymakers, governments, authorities are realizing that food safety has to be brought into that equation. So food that is not safe will not nourish. And
Mm-hmm.
that's what people are really waking up to.
Yeah, you can't have one without the other. With
Correct.
food security and food safety, they go hand in hand. So it doesn't matter if you have enough food. If the food that you have is inedible, it doesn't really matter, right?
Correct. Yes. In fact, will actually probably give you more problems if you eat food that is not safe. You're going to have public health issues, people are going to fall sick, then people will not go to work, lots of things.
Yeah, it's quite concerning. You speak about antimicrobial resistance in your paper,
Yes.
and we hear about that a lot in the news in terms of medications for people, but you don't often hear about it in the food sector. Can you explain how that relates to food safety?
Sure. So antimicrobial resistance, as you said, is really an issue of global concern. And it has really massive global public health ramifications to it. Um, what climate change is doing really is that it is really expanding the geographical niche of pathogen and pests. And what we are likely to see is an increase in antimicrobial use in preventing diseases in crops, in livestock, and even in aquaculture sector. So this will really ramp up the issue of antimicrobial resistance. Now, the jury is still kind of out on whether or not high temperatures tend to select for more virulence in pathogens. But we know that, for example, high temperatures or extreme heat can cause stress and can compromise immune systems in cattle, also in aquatic species, which makes them more prone to infections, which means you might be adding in more antimicrobials to combat that because you don't want your crops or your animals to be sick because you can't sell that. So what we are dealing with really is a multifaceted kind of an approach here again, where every single sector really needs to work together in
Hmm.
combating climate change. And we need to have better management of crops,
Hmm.
animal production systems, and human sewage, for example, to really avoid cross-contamination between terrestrial and aquatic environments.
Yeah, it's fascinating. What I think is the major takeaway, and maybe you can say a little bit more about this, is our systems need to be a bit better integrated, whether that be through digital systems, just so that we have more of a proactive response, because these things are going to continue and we just
Right.
have to have that better understanding.
Yes, yes, absolutely. It's very important to share that information as well. It's not my information versus their information. We are all in this together. We all live on the same planet. We're all eating the same food. So I think we all have to come together to really combat the issue of climate change.
Yeah, absolutely. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing with me, Keya. I would love to speak with you again, as we continue to learn about this subject, and just share your insight and share your takeaways so that my audience can be more proactive and that we can help, prevent foodborne illness from killing or, hurting more people.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me again, Alexander.